Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Shadow Archives. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. This just happened to me today. My sister and I still like to play Pokemon Go, and tonight we went to the park right next to our house to get a Pokemon from a raid. We were there for about 5 minutes when a car full of people drove past us. The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that usually feels peaceful, but can quickly turn heavy when you realize you aren't as alone as you thought. We were standing near one of the central landmarks in the park, our faces illuminated by the pale blue glow of our smartphone screens. It was a normal evening, or at least it started that way. We have been playing this game for years, and it has become a bit of a tradition for us to wander over to the local park when a rare, legendary raid appears. The park is practically in our backyard, a place we've known since we were children, so we never felt the need to be on guard. But tonight, the air felt different. It was cold, and the shadows under the old oak trees seemed a little deeper and more stagnant than usual. We were focused on the raid, tapping away at our screens to defeat the boss, when the first car drove by. It was a dark sedan, likely a Honda Civic, and it moved slowly along the perimeter road of the park. We didn't think much of it at first. People often drive through the park to clear their heads or look at the stars. But then, only a minute later, the same car appeared again. It rounded the corner from the opposite direction, its headlights cutting through the darkness and sweeping across our legs. This time, I felt a slight prickle of unease at the back of my neck. My sister didn't seem to notice. She was too busy trying to catch the Pokemon that had just appeared on her screen. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself that it was a public park and people were allowed to drive wherever they wanted. However, the car didn't leave. It circled the block and came back a third time, and this time it slowed down even more as it passed our position. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see exactly who was inside, but I could make out the silhouettes of several people. As the car crawled past us at a walking pace, I noticed that the passengers were leaning toward the glass, their faces turned directly toward us. They weren't just passing by anymore, they were observing us. It was a predatory kind of observation, the way a person might look at something they are considering picking up. I felt a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. I looked at my sister and told her that we should probably leave, but she was frustrated because the raid battle was almost over, and she didn't want to lose her progress. She told me I was being paranoid, and that it was probably just some kids looking for the same Pokemon we were. But I knew it wasn't that. There was no glow of phones from inside that car, and they hadn't stopped at the gym location to join the raid. They were just circling us. I stood there, my eyes darting between my sister's screen and the dark road, waiting for the headlights to reappear. When the car came around for the fourth time, I didn't care about the game anymore. I reached out and grabbed my sister's arm, telling her in a low, firm voice that we were leaving right now. She finally looked up and saw the car idling near the park exit, its engine a low, rhythmic thrum in the silence. She finally seemed to register the wrongness of the situation. The car stayed there for a few seconds, its brake lights glowing like two angry red eyes in the dark, before it slowly pulled away and disappeared around the corner. We started walking back toward our house, which was only a few hundred yards away. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward us, and every rustle of the wind in the leaves sounded like approaching footsteps. We were about halfway home when the car reappeared. It didn't come from behind us this time. It pulled out of a side street ahead of us and began to drive slowly in our direction. My heart was pounding against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst. The car passed us, and as it did, I saw the silhouettes inside shift again. all of them turning their heads to watch us as we walked. Once the car was a little past us and its taillights were fading, I didn't wait for another pass. I told my sister to run, and we both bolted. We sprinted across the grass and down our driveway, our breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. We burst through the front door and locked it immediately, leaning against the wood as we tried to catch our breath. My sister was still trying to rationalize it, her voice trembling as she said it was probably just a couple of drunk teens playing a prank. She wanted to believe that the world was still the safe place she thought it was. But I couldn't let it go. I felt like I had seen something in the way that car moved, a deliberate and calculated intent that went beyond a simple prank. After a few minutes, when the adrenaline had settled into a dull, shaking hum, I decided to go back out to the front porch, just to see if they were still around. I stayed in the shadows of the doorway, peering through the glass of the storm door. A few houses down the street, I saw a car that looked exactly like the one that had been stalking us. It was idling near the curb, its headlights turned off. As I watched, the door opened and someone stepped out. I didn't get a good look at their face. It was too dark and the distance was too great. But I saw the silhouette of a person standing there, looking toward our house. It felt like they were marking the location, confirming where we had run to. I didn't stay to see what they would do next. I retreated back into the house and made sure every single window and door was locked and bolted. My sister was already upstairs, but I stayed in the living room, sitting in the dark and listening to the sounds of the street outside. While I was sitting there, trying to process the fear and writing down what had happened, I heard the unmistakable sound of a car speeding down our street. It was the high-pitched whine of a small engine being pushed to its limit, and as it passed our house, I caught a glimpse of a dark shape through the blinds. It was a Honda Civic, or something very close to it. The car didn't stop, but the way it roared past felt like a final, aggressive message. It was as if they wanted us to know that they were still out there, that they knew where we lived, and that they could come back whenever they chose. I stayed awake for hours, every creak of the floorboards making me jump, every distant headlight on the wall feeling like a threat. The horror of the experience lies in the transition from a harmless game to a situation where you are being hunted. Pokémon Go is designed to get people outside, to explore their neighborhoods and interact with their surroundings. But tonight, that exploration led us directly into the path of something dark. It makes me realize how vulnerable we really are when we are distracted by our screens. Our eyes fixed on a digital world while the real world is closing in around us. The park, which had always been a place of happy memories, now felt like a hunting ground. I thought about all the other times we had gone out late at night to play, and I wondered how many times we had been watched without even knowing it. My sister's theory about drunk teens is a comforting one, but it doesn't explain the persistence of the car. Drunk teens usually shout something or throw something. They don't circle you 5 times in total silence, watching you with a focused intensity. This felt much more like a coordinated effort, a group of people who had decided that we were their targets for the night. The way they followed us home was the most disturbing part. It turned a random encounter at the park into a personal threat against our sanctuary. Now, when I look out my front window, I don't see the familiar street where I grew up. I see a place where a dark car can sit and wait in the shadows. I keep thinking about the person I saw getting out of the car. Who were they? What were they looking for? The uncertainty is a specialized kind of torture. If they had just yelled something at us, I could dismiss it as a jerk being a jerk. But the silence and the repetition suggest a much darker motive. It felt like we were being studied, like they were testing our reactions to see how far they could push us before we broke. And the fact that they knew exactly which house we ran into means that the prank, if that's what it was, isn't necessarily over. They have a piece of information about us now that we can't take back. I don't think I'll be playing Pokemon Go at night anymore, at least not at that park. The game hasn't changed, but I have. I see the world through a different lens now, one that is much more aware of the cars that pass too slowly and the people who watch for too long. I find myself checking the locks on the doors multiple times before I can even think about going to bed. The joyful activities we engage in can so easily be twisted into something horrific when the wrong people are involved. It's a reminder that we are never as safe as we think we are, even in our own neighborhoods, and even when we are just a few steps from our own front doors. The sound of that car speeding away is still echoing in my mind. It was a loud, defiant noise that seemed to mock our fear. It was the sound of someone who knew they had gotten away with something, someone who had enjoyed the power they held over us for those few minutes. I hoped that it really was just a group of stupid kids who didn't realize how much they were terrifying us. But the darker part of my mind tells me otherwise. It tells me that there is a reason they were out there tonight, and there is a reason they chose us. The world is full of predators who look for the distracted and the vulnerable, and tonight, for a few minutes, that was us. I find it terrifying how quickly your perception of a place can be destroyed. The park was my favorite place to relax, to walk the dog, or to just sit and think. Now it's the place where the car circled. It's the place where I felt the eyes of strangers on me. It will take a long time before I can walk through those gates again without looking over my shoulder every few seconds. My sister still wants to believe it was nothing, and I envy her for that. I wish I could just laugh it off and go back to my life, but I can't. The fear has a weight to it now, a permanent presence that I have to carry. As I finish writing this, the street is silent again. The Honda Civic hasn't come back for another pass, and the shadows under the trees have stopped moving. But the silence isn't peaceful anymore. It's a heavy, expectant silence, the kind that feels like a breath being held. I know that the car is still out there somewhere, moving through the night and looking for the next person with their head down, focused on their phone. I hope that person is luckier than we were, or at least faster, because the world is a much stranger and more dangerous place than a game could ever prepare you for. And sometimes the things you find in the park aren't the ones you were looking for. I've decided to tell my parents about what happened tomorrow morning. I don't want to worry them, but I think it's important that they know there was a suspicious car in the neighborhood. We need to be more careful, to look out for each other, and to never take our safety for granted. The fucked up stuff that happens in the world isn't always a headline on the news. Sometimes it's just a car that passes you one too many times in a quiet park. It's a lesson that I learned the hard way tonight, and it's a lesson that I will never forget as long as I live in this house. If you ever find yourself out late at night, playing a game or just enjoying the air, please stay aware of your surroundings. Don't let your screen be the only thing you see. Look at the cars, look at the people, and listen to that small voice in your head that tells you when something is wrong. That voice is your oldest and best friend, and tonight it was the only thing that kept me and my sister safe. The park is still there, and the Pokemon are still there, but the world is a little bit darker now, and the car is still out there, somewhere in the night, waiting for the next raid to start. I keep looking at the lock on the front door, making sure the bolt is turned all the way. It's a small metal thing that is supposed to keep the world out, but it feels so insignificant after what I saw tonight. A car full of people can follow you home, can watch where you live, and can disappear into the night before anyone even knows they were there. It's a specialized kind of horror, the realization that you are being watched by people who have no face and no name, but who know exactly who you are. The night continues and the stars are still shining, but for me, the magic of the evening has been replaced by a deep, lingering dread. The Honda Civic is a common car, one that you see 100 times a day, and that's what makes it so effective as a tool for stalking. It blends in. It doesn't stand out. It could be anyone, and that means it could be anywhere. I'll be looking at every dark sedan I see for the next few weeks, wondering if it's the same one, wondering if the people inside are the same ones who watched us in the park. It's a cycle of paranoia that I didn't ask for, but it's the price I have to pay for what happened tonight. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and never forget that the shadows are always watching. My grandfather on my mom's side was a medic in Vietnam. He always rode in on those Hueys, the iconic helicopters that defined the era, and his job was usually to help wounded soldiers, not Marines specifically, but the army grunts who were out in the thick of the jungle. He passed away last year, not long after my grandmother, but the memory of our final conversation still sits heavily in my mind. The last time I saw him alive, he seemed different. There was a weight in the air, a gravity that hadn't been there before. He looked at me with an intensity that made the room feel smaller, and he whispered for me to come closer. He said he had something to tell me, something he didn't want me to ever repeat to my grandmother or my mother. I promised him I wouldn't, and then he leaned in, his voice trembling just enough for me to notice. He knew I was thinking about joining the Marines, and he wanted to give me a piece of advice that felt more like a desperate plea. He told me never to go anywhere near soldiers who had radios. I tried to dismiss it at first, telling him that modern Marines don't really use the same kind of cumbersome radios he had to deal with in the 60s. But he stopped me, his hand gripping my arm. He told me to just stay away from anyone important, especially the commanding officers. He stopped looking at me then and stared down at the rug, and for a second I saw his eyes. His pupils were totally dilated, wide and dark, as if he were staring into a void or focusing on something miles away and decades in the past. The room was silent except for his ragged breathing, and then he started to talk, and he didn't stop for a long time. He said that when he was in Vietnam, he became used to the sight of death and the smell of blood. As a medic, it was his daily reality, something he had to tuck away in a corner of his mind just to keep functioning. But he told me there was one experience that scarred him more deeply than all the others combined. It was a day when his helicopter was called in for an emergency extraction. They were completely unprepared because the call had come in with such frantic urgency. A platoon of about 50 or 60 guys had been caught in a devastating ambush, and the landing zone was dangerously close to the active fighting. As the Huey descended, the air was thick with the scent of smoke and the deafening roar of the rotors. Through the open door, he saw the chaos on the ground, the flashes of gunfire, the dirt kicking up from the soil, and the bodies of men scattered in the grass. In the middle of that hell, he saw the radio man. The boy was standing near the lieutenant, right in the center of the crossfire. As the helicopter touched down, the radio man turned his head and looked directly at my grandfather. He had this incredible look on his face, a mixture of pure relief and joy that seemed to say the cavalry had finally arrived and they were all going to be okay. My grandfather described the radio man's smile as something precious, the kind of honest, wide-eyed smile a child makes on Christmas morning when they see the tree for the first time. It was a moment of pure humanity in a place that had become entirely inhuman. But that smile only lasted for a half second. In the next heartbeat, the radio man, the lieutenant, and the 4 soldiers standing around them were suddenly engulfed in a massive ball of fire. A grenade or a mortar shell had landed right in their midst, turning the center of the platoon into a scorched crater of heat and shrapnel. My grandfather didn't think, he just reacted. He sprang out of the helicopter and ran toward the wall of fire, his medic bag swinging at his side. The air was so hot it felt like it was melting the hair off his arms. When he reached the site of the explosion, he found the radio man. The boy was lying on the ground, stomach down, and the sight was enough to make even a seasoned medic want to scream. His skin was a bright, angry red. His uniform had been shredded into charred rags, and the heavy metal radio had literally been fused to his back by the heat of the blast. The metal and the flesh had become one single horrific object. Despite the catastrophic injuries, the boy was still conscious. He looked up at my grandfather, his eyes glassy and unfocused, and he started to speak. But he wasn't in the jungle anymore. He looked at my grandfather and said, "Just like the woods, remember, Tony? At the creek, we would skip stones." My grandfather's name wasn't Tony, and he realized then that the boy was hallucinating, his mind retreating to a safer, happier time as his body began to shut down. The radio man looked my grandfather in the eyes one last time, whispered, "Right, Ma?" And then he died right there on the floor of the helicopter during the frantic ride back to the base. The horror of that story has lived with me every day since he told it. It wasn't just the gore or the violence that made it terrifying. It was the sheer wasted potential of a human life. My grandfather later found out that the boy was only 16 years old. He had lied about his age to join the fight, driven by a sense of duty or adventure that he couldn't possibly understand. Back home, he had a family that loved him, a girl he was planning to marry, and a college fund already set up for his return. He had an entire universe of possibilities ahead of him, books he would never read, children he would never hold, and a life that would never be lived. And all of it, every single bit of that potential, was ended in an instant by the random throw of a grenade. There was no brave last stand, no heroic sacrifice that changed the course of the war. It was just a sudden, violent, and meaningless transition from being someone with everything to being nothing at all. My grandfather's dilated eyes told me more than his words ever could. He wasn't just telling me a story, he was showing me the ghosts that walked beside him every day. He wanted me to understand that in war, death isn't a movie. It isn't always about honor or glory. Sometimes it's just about being the person standing next to the guy with the radio. The radio man was a target because the radio represented communication and command. And the enemy knew that if you took out the radio, you took out the heart of the unit. That young boy with his Christmas smile and his dreams of skipping stones was just a coordinate on a map for someone else. The horror is in the randomness. It's in the fact that you can be the greatest something, a beloved son, a bright student, a loyal friend, and in a fraction of a second, you can become the most nothing of nothing. I think about that boy often. I think about how his mother must have felt when she got the telegram, never knowing that his last words were for her, even if he was looking at a stranger in a blood-stained medic vest. I think about Tony and the creek and the stones they skipped, and how that memory was the only thing the boy had left to cling to as the world faded away. It makes the idea of joining the military feel very different. It strips away the polished boots and the sharp uniforms and leaves you with the image of a 16-year-old boy fused to a piece of machinery. The potential of a life is such a fragile, beautiful thing, and we live in a world that is far too willing to throw it away. My grandfather saw that potential get snuffed out thousands of times, but that one boy with the radio was the one who broke him. The dilated pupils I saw in my grandfather's eyes haunt me. It was like he was still on that Huey, still feeling the vibration of the engine and the heat of the fire. He was a medic, a man whose life was dedicated to healing, yet he was forced to be a witness to a destruction he couldn't stop. He carried the weight of that 16-year-old's death for over 50 years, keeping it secret from his wife and his daughter, only letting it out when he knew his own time was almost up. He wanted to pass that burden to me, not to hurt me, but to protect me. He wanted me to see the world through his eyes for just a moment so that I would understand the true cost of the path I was considering. He wanted me to know that when you go to war, you aren't just risking your life. You're risking your very existence and everything you could have ever been. The nothing of nothing is a phrase that stays with me. It describes a kind of void that is hard to wrap your head around. It's not just death, it's the erasure of a future. When that boy died, every version of the man he was supposed to become died with him. Every conversation he would have had, every meal he would have eaten, and every person he would have loved simply vanished. There was no trace left of him except for a name on a wall and a charred radio. To my grandfather, that was the ultimate horror. He saw the light behind the boy's eyes go out, and he knew that the world was a darker place because of it. He wanted me to realize that I am a something right now. I have a family, I have goals, and I have a future, and he didn't want to see me become a nothing on some faraway battlefield. As I look back on that conversation, I realize it was a gift of honesty in a world that often prefers comfortable lies. He didn't tell me about the medals or the brotherhood. He told me about the smell of burnt skin and the hallucinations of a dying child. He told me about the Christmas smile that was gone in half a second. It was a specialized kind of horror, one that doesn't need ghosts or monsters to make your skin crawl. It only needs the truth of what we do to each other. My grandfather died a few months later, and I hope he finally found the peace that he couldn't find here on Earth. I hope he's somewhere where the Hueys don't fly and the radios don't matter. But for me, the story remains a permanent part of my life, a warning from the past that I will never forget. The choice to join the Marines is no longer a simple one for me. I see the face of the 16-year-old radio man in every recruiting poster and every commercial. I hear my grandfather's voice telling me to stay away from the officers and the radios. I understand that the glory people talk about is often just a thin veil over a much darker reality. The potential of a life is too high a price to pay for a few seconds of combat, especially when that death is as random and meaningless as a grenade in a jungle clearing. I am grateful for the something that I am today, and I am much more careful with my future than I ever was before. My grandfather's dilated eyes saw the truth, and now, thanks to him, I see it too. I think about the Tony at the creek. I wonder if he ever knew what happened to his friend. I wonder if he still remembers skipping those stones, or if that memory is only kept alive by me, a stranger who heard it from a dying medic. It's a strange way for a memory to survive, passed from a dying boy to a young medic, and then down through the generations to me. But it's a memory that carries a heavy lesson. It reminds us that every person we see in a uniform is a person with a history, a family, and a favorite spot by a creek. They aren't just soldiers or Marines. They are children who are far too young to be seeing the bad shit my grandfather mentioned. The horror of war is often told through grand narratives of a strategy and conquest. But the real horror is found in the small, intimate moments. It's found in the smile of a boy who thinks help has arrived, only to be consumed by fire a moment later. It's found in the smell of a radio fused to a human spine. It's found in the final, confused words of a child looking for his mother. My grandfather lived through that horror every day, and he carried it with him until his final breath. He was a hero in my eyes, not because of the lives he saved, but because of the way he cared for the ones he couldn't save. He gave them a witness, someone to hold their hand and listen to their final words, even when those words were meant for someone else. If I ever have a grandson of my own, I hope I don't have a story like that to tell him. I hope I can tell him about a world that learned to value the something in every person. I hope I can tell him about a world where skipping stones at a creek is the most important thing a 16-year-old has to worry about. But until then, I will keep my grandfather's story alive as a warning and a tribute. I will remember the dilated eyes and the Christmas smile, and I will never go near the radios. I will cherish the chance in life that I have, knowing that it was paid for by the silence of those who never got their chance. The most nothing of nothing is a place I never want to visit, and thanks to my granddad, I know exactly where the path to it begins. The Huey helicopters are museum pieces now, relics of a time that most people want to forget. But for some, the sound of those rotors is still the sound of hope and terror. For my grandfather, it was the sound of his youth being spent in the service of a tragedy. He was a medic, a man who tried to put the pieces back together, but some things can't be fixed. Some things are broken forever by the throw of a grenade. The radio man's smile is a ghost that will never fade, a reminder of the precious, fragile nature of our existence. We are all just a half second away from everything changing, and the only thing we can do is to hold on to each other and try to stay away from the fire. I think my grandfather knew he was going to die soon when he told me that story. He wanted to make sure his most important lesson was passed on. He had seen the most nothing of nothing, and he wanted to make sure his family stayed on the side of the something. It was a final act of love from a man who had seen the worst of humanity and still found the strength to care about his grandson's future. I am glad I got to see him one last time, and I am glad he chose to share that burden with me. It's a heavy weight, but it's one that keeps me grounded and reminds me of the true value of a life. The world is full of potential, full of 16-year-olds with college setups and girls back home and families that love them. We have to be the ones who protect that potential. We have to be the ones who say that a life is worth more than a piece of territory or a political goal. We have to remember the radio man and the lieutenant and the 4 soldiers who were engulfed in fire, and we have to make sure their stories aren't lost to the jungle of history. My grandfather did his part by telling me, and now I am doing my part by remembering. The rug in his room, the rug he was staring at with those wide, dilated eyes, is probably still there. But the man is gone. Only the story remains, a haunting, horrific, and beautiful reminder of what it means to be human in a world that sometimes forgets. I didn't believe in the paranormal at first. Growing up, I was the kind of kid who looked for a logical explanation for everything. If a floorboard creaked, it was just the house settling. If a shadow moved, it was just a car driving by outside. I viewed ghost stories as nothing more than campfire entertainment, designed to make your heart race, but ultimately harmless. However, there is one specific memory from when I was about 10 years old that refuses to be debunked. It is a story that has sat in the back of my mind for years, and every time it resurfaces, it brings back that same cold, paralyzing dread I felt in my childhood bedroom. It remains the most unnerving experience of my life, and other than telling my mom once, this is the only place I have ever come to vent about the night the world stopped making sense. It was a typical evening, or so it seemed. I was 10 years old, tucked into my bed on the second floor of our home. Downstairs, I could hear the muffled, comforting drone of the television, where my mom was watching her late-night shows. The house was filled with the familiar sounds of a family at rest, and I was just beginning to drift into that heavy, peaceful sleep. My brother was out at his Army Cadets meeting, something he did regularly. He usually came home late, so hearing the front door open at an odd hour wasn't necessarily a cause for alarm. When I heard the heavy thud of the front door followed by the sound of someone running up the stairs, my immediate thought was that he had finally made it back and was rushing to get to bed before our mom told him off for being late. The footsteps on the stairs were heavy and fast, vibrating through the floorboards. I sat up in bed, rubbed my eyes, and looked toward my open bedroom door, expecting to see my brother's familiar face as he hurried past. The figure finally reached the landing and moved past my doorway, but the moment I looked at him, my heart stopped. It wasn't my brother. The person was wearing a dark, oversized hoodie with the hood pulled low over their head, completely obscuring their face in deep shadow. Even though I couldn't see a single feature, I knew with a bone-deep certainty that this was a total stranger. This person was massive, standing far taller than any member of my family, and their presence felt heavy and aggressive in the narrow hallway. I was too terrified to scream or run for my mom. I felt like my vocal cords had been cut. My survival instinct took over in the only way a 10-year-old knows how. I dove under my heavy blankets, pulling them over my head and curling into a tiny ball. I stayed there, barely daring to breathe, my ears straining to hear where the stranger went. To my absolute horror, the footsteps stopped right outside my door. For several minutes, the figure just stood there in total silence. The only thing I could hear was the sound of heavy, ragged panting. It was a wet, desperate sound, as if the person had just run a marathon or was in the middle of a frantic panic attack. The sound of that breathing, so close to my bed and yet so detached from anyone I knew, made the air in the room feel freezing. I remained frozen under my blanket, not able to make a single sound. I felt like if I moved even an inch, the figure would realize I was awake and reach through the fabric to grab me. Time seemed to stretch into eternity in that dark, stuffy space under the covers. Finally, after what felt like hours but was likely only a few minutes, the panting moved. I heard the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps walking away from my door and into my brother's room across the hall. I heard his door click shut, and then the house returned to that oppressive, unnatural silence. I lay there in the dark, my mind racing. I wondered if I should run downstairs to my mom, but the thought of crossing that hallway and passing my brother's door was even more terrifying than staying put. I stayed awake, shivering under my sheets, for about an hour. I was trapped in a state of pure paranoia, waiting for the door to open again or for the panting to return to my bedside. Then I heard the sound of the front door opening for a second time. I heard familiar, lighter footsteps coming up the stairs. Not running this time, just a normal, tired walk. I peeked out from under the blanket just as my actual brother walked into the hallway and headed toward his room. I heard him open his door, walk inside, and start getting ready for bed as if nothing was wrong. The transition was so mundane that it made the previous hour feel like a fever dream, but I knew what I had seen. I knew the difference between my brother and the giant in the hoodie. Years have passed since that night, and I eventually gathered the courage to tell my mom about what happened. She listened, but she gave me the answer I expected. She said it was probably just my brother messing with me, playing a prank to see if he could get a rise out of his younger sibling, but that explanation falls apart when you look at the facts. My brother is only 3 years older than me. At the time of the incident, he was only about 5 feet 3 inches tall, a typical height for a young teenager. The man I saw in the hallway was truly tall, a towering figure that nearly touched the top of the doorframe. There is no way a 5'3" boy could have transformed into a giant and back again in the span of an hour. This realization is what unnerves me to this day. If it wasn't my brother, then who was the man in the hoodie? How did he get into the house? And more importantly, where did he go? When my brother walked into his room an hour later, he didn't mention seeing anyone. He didn't scream. He didn't run out, and he didn't say there was a stranger hiding in his closet or under his bed. It was as if the figure had simply evaporated into the walls the moment he entered the room. The idea that a massive, panting stranger could just manifest in our home and then vanish into thin air is a specialized kind of horror that defies any logical debunking. It makes me wonder if the house had a thin spot where things could cross over, or if I had witnessed a residual haunting of a moment of violence from the past. The memory of the panting is the detail that haunts my dreams. It wasn't the sound of a ghost or a spirit. It sounded like a living, breathing human being in a state of extreme physical or emotional distress. It makes me think about the possibility that it wasn't a ghost at all, but a real intruder who somehow escaped before my brother got home. But then I remember the silence of the hallway and the fact that the front door never opened a second time until my brother arrived. The logistics don't work for a person, and they don't work for a prank. It leaves me with a void of an answer, a mystery that sits in the center of my childhood like a dark stain. I often think about the tall man archetype that appears in so many horror stories and paranormal reports. There seems to be a common thread of people seeing these oversized, shadowed figures in hoodies or trench coats, often standing still and watching. For me, he wasn't just a shadow. He was a physical presence that moved the air and made the floor creak. The height difference is the most haunting piece of evidence. I can still see that silhouette in my mind. The way he towered over everything in the hallway, making the ceiling seem low and claustrophobic. It was a sight that no 10-year-old should ever have to process, especially when you're alone in the dark. My mom's skepticism is a comfort to her, but for me, it feels like a dismissal of a trauma. I know what I saw, and I know how I felt. That paralyzing fear wasn't a product of an overactive imagination. It was a reaction to a genuine threat. Even now, as an adult living in my own place, I find myself checking the hallways at night. I look at the doorways and I listen for the sound of heavy breathing. The paranormal isn't just a theory for me anymore. It's a memory of a night when the rules of the world were suspended. It proves that you can be in your own home, with your family just a floor away, and still be completely and utterly alone in the face of the unknown. I'm glad I found a place to vent about this, because keeping it bottled up only makes the memory feel heavier. It's a story that doesn't have a satisfying conclusion or a clear explanation, and maybe that's why it's so scary. It's a lingering question mark that reminds me that we are never as safe as we think we are. The fucked up stuff in the world doesn't always happen to other people on the news. Sometimes it happens in your own hallway at 10 years old. I survived that night, but a part of that 10-year-old kid is still under those blankets, waiting for the panting to stop and the sun to come up. The house we lived in wasn't particularly old or famous for being haunted, but after that night, I never looked at it the same way. I started noticing other small things, cold spots in the hallway, the feeling of being watched when I was in the kitchen, and the way the cat would hiss at empty corners. It was as if the man in the hoodie had opened a door that couldn't be fully closed. He was a visitor from a place of shadows and heavy breathing, and he left a permanent mark on the atmosphere of our home. I often wonder if the people living there now ever hear someone running up the stairs in the middle of the night, or if they've ever seen a tall silhouette standing outside their bedroom door. The fact that he went into my brother's room is the part that still makes my skin crawl. What was he doing in there for that hour? Was he just standing in the dark, waiting, or was he a version of my brother from a different, darker timeline? A doppelganger that had arrived early? The possibilities are all terrifying. When my brother eventually moved out and I had that room to myself for a while, I never felt comfortable in it. I always felt like there was someone else in the room with me, standing just behind the closet door or sitting at the foot of the bed. It was a heavy, suffocating energy that made it impossible to ever truly relax. I hope that by sharing this, it resonates with someone else who has seen something they can't explain. We live in a world that is obsessed with facts and evidence, but some things defy measurement. The man in the hoodie was a reality for me, a horrific encounter with something that shouldn't have been there. It taught me to trust my eyes and my instincts, even when everyone else tells me I'm wrong. The height difference, the panting, and the impossible timing are all pieces of a puzzle that I will never be able to solve, and maybe that's the point. Some mysteries are meant to stay in the dark, reminding us to always keep the lights on and the doors locked. If you ever find yourself awake in the middle of the night and you hear someone running up your stairs, don't just assume it's your family. Listen for the breathing. Watch the height of the shadow. And if you see a man in a hoodie who is much taller than he should be, don't wait for him to move. Get to safety, because the world is much stranger than we like to admit. And sometimes the person walking into your brother's room isn't your brother at all. It's a lesson I learned at 10 years old, and it's a lesson that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. The memory of the hoodie-clad giant is my own personal ghost story, a dark chapter in the history of my childhood that refused to be forgotten. I'm an adult now, with a life of my own and a logical mind, but the 10-year-old in me still remembers the terror of that night. I still remember the sound of the breathing and the sight of the silhouette, and I still believe that somewhere, in the shadows of that old house, the tall man is still standing, waiting for the next person to look up and see him. This one time I was home alone watching Insidious for the 5th time, and looking back, I still don't really know why I chose that specific movie. There is something about the atmosphere of that film, the clicking of the old clocks, the high-pitched violins, and the idea that something can follow you back from the shadows, that always gets under my skin. Being home alone in a large, quiet house usually makes me a bit jumpy anyway. But I figured that since I had seen it so many times, it wouldn't be able to scare me anymore. I thought I was immune to the jump scares and the creepy face of the red demon, but I was wrong. The house felt heavier that night, the silence between the movie's scenes pressing in on me like a physical weight. Every creak of the floorboards and every groan of the settling wood seemed to sync up with the tension on the screen. I was curled up on the couch, the only light coming from the television, casting long, dancing shadows across the living room walls. It was one of those nights where the air feels thick and you can't help but look over your shoulder even though you know no one else is there. Around the middle of the movie, I started to feel a bit dehydrated, my throat tight from the suspense. I paused the film and stood up, the sudden silence of the house feeling almost deafening after the loud, jarring soundtrack. I walked to the kitchen to grab a glass of water, my footsteps sounding unnaturally loud on the linoleum. As I stood by the sink, letting the water run cold, I heard a sound that made me freeze. It was the distinct, sharp whistle of wind coming from the direction of my bedroom. It wasn't just a draft. It sounded like a window had been flung wide open, and the night air was rushing in with a frantic, purposeful energy. My heart started to thud against my ribs. I knew for a fact that I had closed and locked every window in the house before my parents left. We had stray cats in the neighborhood that sometimes climbed onto the sills, and I briefly wondered if one of them had somehow managed to force its way in. But deep down, I knew that was impossible. I walked toward my room, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorframe. When I stepped inside, the chill in the air was immediate. It felt like walking into a freezer. My curtains were swishing around violently, whipped into a frenzy by a wind that shouldn't have been there. I looked at the window and saw that it was indeed wide open, the latch hanging loosely as if it had been undone from the inside. I scanned the darkness of the yard outside, half expecting to see a face peering back at me from the trees, but there was nothing but the swaying branches and the distant hum of the streetlights. I stepped forward, my skin crawling with a sudden sense of being watched, and I slammed the window shut, locking it with a forced click. I pulled the curtains tight, trying to shut out the feeling of the night, and headed back to the kitchen to finish getting my water. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind or a faulty latch, but the fear was already beginning to take root in my stomach. As I was standing in the kitchen, trying to calm my racing heart with a sip of water, I heard the noise again. It was a soft, muffled thud coming from my room, followed by the sound of something dragging slowly across the wooden floor. I didn't think, I just reacted. I sprinted back to my room, my adrenaline pushing me forward. I burst through the door and flicked on the light, my eyes darting around the space. Everything looked normal at first, but then I looked at my desk. Sitting right in the center of the polished wood was my teddy bear, the one I've had for years and still sleep with every night. My blood turned to ice. I knew exactly where I had left that bear. It had been tucked under my covers on the bed when I went to watch the movie. There was no one else in the house to move it, and no amount of wind could have lifted a heavy stuffed animal from a bed and placed it perfectly upright on a desk across the room. I stood there for a long time, staring at the bear's glass eyes, which seemed to be reflecting the light in a way that felt almost sentient. I was getting a bit scared, not gonna lie. The house, which had always been my sanctuary, now felt like a cage. I realized I couldn't stay in my room anymore. The air felt charged with something invisible, a static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up. My parents were away at a wedding, my twin brother was at a sleepover at a friend's house, and my younger brother was with my parents. I was truly, completely alone. I decided the best thing to do would be to go to my parents' room and try to sleep there. It was a larger room, further away from the back of the house, and it always felt more secure. I grabbed a pillow and ran down the hallway, not looking back at the dark mouth of my own bedroom door. I climbed into their bed, pulling the heavy duvet up to my chin, and tried to focus on the sounds of the neighborhood outside. The distant cars, the barking of a dog, anything to drown out the silence of the house. I closed my eyes and tried to force myself to breathe slowly, waiting for the exhaustion to take over. But the house wouldn't let me rest. Just as I started to fall into that hazy state between wakefulness and sleep, I felt a distinct, icy sensation on my shoulder. It wasn't an accidental brush of the blanket. It was a deliberate three-fingered tap. The pressure was firm and cold, as if a hand made of snow had just touched me to wake me up. I bolted upright, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and I reached for the lamp on the nightstand. When the light flickered on, I saw my teddy bear sitting right next to me on the pillow. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I had left that bear in my room on the desk. I hadn't brought it with me when I fled to my parents' room. It was physically impossible for it to be there, yet it was leaning against the headboard, its small, stitched mouth looking like it was stretched into a smirk. I freaked out and grabbed my phone, my fingers fumbling as I tried to type a message to my guy friend. I needed to talk to someone, anyone, just to remind myself that I was still part of the real world. I told him what was happening, my words coming out in a frantic jumble. But as the minutes ticked by, the delivered sign just sat there. He left me on red. The isolation felt like a physical blow. I felt like the world outside had vanished, leaving me alone in this shifting, haunted version of my home. I tried to ignore the bear and the tapping, telling myself it was all in my head, a product of watching too much horror and being alone in the dark. I lay back down, turning my back to the bear, and closed my eyes again, but the feeling of being watched had intensified. It was a heavy, predatory gaze that seemed to be coming from the corner of the room, far away from the bed. The paranoia was at an all-time high at this point. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, a rhythmic thud that sounded like someone walking up the stairs. I kept my eyes tightly shut, but I could still feel the darkness of the room pressing against my eyelids. Every time the house settled, it sounded like a whisper. Every time the wind brushed against the roof, it sounded like a hand scratching at the shingles. I felt like the shadows in the room were beginning to detach themselves from the walls, moving slowly toward the bed. I tried to pray, I tried to count, I tried to think of anything but the movie Insidious and the idea of entities crossing over into our world. But then I made the mistake of opening my eyes just a sliver. In the far corner of the room, where the shadows were the deepest, I saw a silhouette. It was taller than a person, a thin, elongated shape that seemed to be made of a darkness that was even blacker than the night. It had no discernible features, no eyes or mouth, but I could feel its focus entirely on me. It stood perfectly still, its long, spindly arms hanging at its sides. I blinked, my heart stopping for a beat, and when I opened them again, the corner was empty. The silhouette was gone. But the feeling of its presence remained. It felt like it had just stepped behind the veil, waiting for me to close my eyes again so it could move closer. I realized then that I wasn't going to be able to sleep. Whatever was in the house with me wasn't going to let me go that easily. I spent the rest of the night sitting upright in the center of the bed, the lights turned on to their brightest setting. I grabbed my laptop and started watching YouTube videos, anything loud and bright and mindless to keep the silence at bay. I watched vloggers talking about their lives, gaming videos with constant commentary, and comedy skits that felt hollow and unfunny in the face of the terror I was feeling. Every time a video ended and there was a few seconds of silence before the next one started, I would feel the panic start to rise again. I kept checking the corner of the room, expecting the silhouette to reappear, and I kept my distance from the teddy bear, which stayed exactly where it was on the pillow. The hours felt like days. I watched the clock on my phone, counting down the minutes until the sun would finally start to rise. The darkness outside the window felt infinite, a vast, hungry space that was trying to seep into the room through the cracks in the glass. I thought about calling my parents, but I didn't want to ruin their night or make them worry when there was nothing they could do from miles away. I thought about running to a neighbor's house, but the idea of stepping out into the dark hallway and walking past my open bedroom door was even more terrifying than staying in the bed. I was trapped by my own fear, a prisoner in a room that was supposed to be safe. When the first gray light of dawn finally began to filter through the curtains, the oppressive weight of the house started to lift. The shadows retreated back to the corners, and the air lost that freezing electric quality. I finally felt like I could breathe again. I walked back to my room, my legs feeling like lead, and I saw that my window was still locked and the desk was empty. I looked at the bed in my parents' room and saw the teddy bear still sitting on the pillow. I picked it up and threw it into the back of a closet, shutting the door firmly. I didn't care if I was being irrational. I just couldn't look at it anymore. Even now, with the sun fully up and the house filled with the sounds of my family returning, I am still scared as fuck. The memory of that icy tap on my shoulder and the sight of that silhouette is something I can't shake. It changed the way I feel about being home alone. I used to enjoy the peace and quiet, but now the silence just feels like a hiding place for things that don't belong here. I wonder if watching the movie really did act like an invitation, or if the house has always had these shadows and I was just finally tuned in enough to see them. The delivered text on my phone from my friend is a reminder of how quickly you can be isolated when things go wrong, and the empty closet where the bear is hidden feels like it's holding a secret that I'm not ready to face. The scariest part of the whole experience is the realization that the things we think are inanimate can move, and the places we think are empty can be full. The silhouette in the corner wasn't a trick of the light. It was a presence that wanted to be seen. It wanted me to know that I wasn't alone. I don't know if I'll ever be able to watch Insidious again, and I definitely don't think I'll ever be able to sleep in this house alone, without feeling like someone or something is staring at me from the dark. It was a night of pure, unadulterated paranoia that turned my world upside down, a reminder that the veil between our reality and the unknown is much thinner than we like to admit. I still haven't told my parents the full story. I don't want them to think I'm crazy or to make them feel unsafe in their own home. I just told them I had a bad nightmare and couldn't sleep. But every time I walk past that corner in their room, I feel a chill. I think about the silhouette and the way it vanished when I blinked. I think about the cold fingers on my shoulder and the bear that wouldn't stay put. It's a specialized kind of horror that stays with you, a quiet, lingering dread that makes you check the locks twice and keep the lights on a little longer than necessary. If you ever find yourself home alone and you get the urge to watch a horror movie for the 5th time, maybe choose something else. Some stories have a way of leaking out of the screen and into your life, and once they're in, it's hard to get them out. The house is quiet again now, but it's a different kind of quiet. It's the silence of something that is waiting, something that knows I'm watching, and something that is perfectly content to sit in the shadows until the next time the lights go out. I survived the night, but the fear is still here, a permanent resident of my mind that reminds me to never, ever get too comfortable in the dark. I hope that by sharing this, it serves as a warning to anyone who thinks they're immune to the scares. The world is a much stranger place than we give it credit for, and sometimes the things we see in the movies are just a reflection of the things that are already standing in the corner of our rooms. Stay safe. Keep your windows locked. And if you ever feel a tap on your shoulder when you're alone, don't open your eyes. Some things are better left unseen, and some mysteries are better left in the dark. My aunt lives at the beach, in a quiet house far away from where the rest of my family lives. Every summer vacation, it has become a tradition for us to visit her, especially for the children in the family who look forward to the sand and the waves all year long. Because the house gets so full of kids and many of the adults can't make the trip due to work, my family usually hires a babysitter to help my aunt keep things under control. Years ago, they contracted a middle-aged lady who was, to put it bluntly, one of the rudest people I have ever met. From the moment she walked through the door, she seemed to have a chip on her shoulder. She was sharp-tongued, impatient, and we all hated her instantly. The first 2 weeks of that vacation were absolutely miserable. The atmosphere in the house was tense, and we spent most of our time trying to stay out of her way to avoid her constant scolding. But then something strange happened. Suddenly, almost overnight, her entire personality shifted. She became incredibly nice, almost unnervingly so. She was especially focused on my cousin, who was only 9 years old at the time. The change was so drastic that we didn't know what to make of it. But as kids, we were just happy the yelling had stopped. They started playing together all the time, and the lady became so attached to my cousin that they even began sleeping in the same room. It seemed like the vacation had finally turned around and we were having fun, but there was a lingering, heavy feeling in the air that none of us could quite explain. It was like a storm was brewing just beyond the horizon, waiting for the perfect moment to break over the house. The end of that week is where the story takes a dark and horrific turn. My cousin, my brother, and I were sitting on the large floral couch in the living room, talking with the babysitter. The sun had gone down, and the only sound is the distant, rhythmic crashing of the waves against the shore. Out of nowhere, the conversation took a very dark path. The lady started talking about her family, mentioning that she was one of 11 siblings. However, she told us she had only ever met 10 of them, because the eldest brother had died before she was even born. Then, with a chilling level of detail, She began explaining exactly how he had passed away. She said he had started feeling unwell, tried to stand up to walk, but suffered a massive stroke. He fell forward, hitting his head violently against the doorframe, and died right there on the floor. The way she described the sound of the impact and the look on his face was enough to make our blood run cold. We were terrified, the kind of fear that sits deep in your chest and makes it hard to breathe. The joyful atmosphere of the beach house had evaporated, replaced by a morbid, suffocating dread. We didn't have anything left to talk about after that, so we all went to bed immediately, hoping to just sleep off the unease. My cousin went to the room she shared with the lady, and my brother and I went to our own room. The house fell into a deep, unnatural silence, the kind of silence that feels like a physical weight pressing down on the roof. The middle of the night brought the true horror. We were all jolted awake by the sound of my cousin screaming for help. It wasn't just a cry, it was a high-pitched, primal shriek of pure terror. My aunt was the first one to reach the room, her heart pounding as she threw open the door. The sight that greeted her was like a scene from a nightmare. The babysitter was crumpled on the floor in a heap, and my cousin was backed into the corner of her bed, sobbing uncontrollably. The air in the room felt thick and cold, and the lady was completely unresponsive. We called for an ambulance, and as the paramedics carried the lady out on a stretcher, the blue and red lights flashing against the white sand outside, we finally sat my cousin down to ask her what had happened. Through her tears, my cousin told us a story that still haunts my dreams. She said she had woken up in the middle of the night to the feeling of someone touching her hair. She opened her eyes to see the babysitter leaning over her in the dark, whispering her name over and over in a soft, melodic voice. My cousin thought the woman was just being sweet and wanted to cuddle, so she didn't feel afraid at first. But then the woman's expression changed. She stood up abruptly, her body stiff and jerky. She tried to take a step toward the door, but her legs seemed to give out. She suffered a massive stroke right there in front of my cousin, falling forward and hitting her head against the door with a sickening thud, exactly like the death of the brother she had described just hours before. A few days later, the doctors at the hospital confirmed what we already feared. The lady had suffered a catastrophic stroke and passed away without ever regaining consciousness. The coincidence was too perfect, too macabre to be anything other than a horrific premonition. It was as if she had spent the evening narrating her own death, unknowingly inviting the same fate that had claimed her brother decades earlier. The fact that she chose to spend her final moments whispering my cousin's name and touching her hair adds a specialized kind of horror to the memory. It felt like she knew the end was coming and she was reaching out to the person she had grown closest to, or perhaps she was passing something on. The house at the beach never felt the same after that summer. We still visit my aunt, but we never hired another babysitter. The room where it happened stayed empty for a long time, the door having a small, permanent scuff mark from where her head had struck the wood. Whenever I pass that door, I can almost hear the soft whispering of my cousin's name and the sound of the fall. It was a fucked up situation that proved that sometimes the stories we tell are more than just memories. They are shadows of what is to come. The transition from the rude, angry lady to the overly kind companion was likely the beginning of her neurological decline, a brightening before the final darkness. My cousin, who is an adult now, still struggles with the memory of those cold fingers in her hair. She remembers the way the lady looked in the moonlight, her eyes wide and unfocused as she described her brother's death, and the way those same eyes looked as she fell. It was a trauma that defined our childhood, a reminder that death is never far away, even on a sunny beach vacation. The ocean continues to roar outside my aunt's house, a constant, unfeeling witness to the tragedies that happen within its walls. We were just kids looking for a fun summer, but we came home with a story that made us realize just how thin the veil between life and death really is. The horror isn't just in the death itself, but in the prediction of it. How could she have known? Was it a coincidence, or was her mind somehow tapping into a family curse as it began to fail? The detail of the door is what gets to me the most. Out of all the ways to fall, she fell exactly like her brother, hitting the exact same part of her head on the exact same type of surface. It feels like a glitch in reality, a dark loop that she was trapped in. I often wonder if she's still there in that room, standing by the bed and waiting for someone to call her name. We eventually learned that the lady didn't have much family left. She was a lonely woman who had spent her life moving from job to job, perhaps carrying the weight of her brother's death with her the entire time. In her final days, she found a connection with a 9-year-old girl, and in her final hours, she shared the secret that had haunted her. It was a tragic, horrific ending to a life that seemed full of bitterness until the very end. The joyful summer we were promised turned into a wake, and the beach sand felt like ashes under our feet as we packed our bags to leave. If you ever find yourself with a stranger who suddenly becomes too kind and starts talking about death, pay attention. The mind is a mysterious thing, and sometimes it knows when the gears are starting to grind to a halt. The babysitter wasn't a monster, but she was a harbinger of her own doom. Her story remains a permanent part of our family history, a chilling tale of a beach house, a stroke, and a death that was told before it happened. We survived the vacation, but we never looked at the door to that bedroom the same way again. The silence of the house at night is now filled with the echo of a scream and the memory of a woman who just wanted to say goodbye. I hope she found the brother she never met, and I hope they are both far away from the doors and the shadows. But for us, the horror is still here, tucked away in the corners of our minds. It's a reminder that the most ordinary people can have the most extraordinary and terrifying ends. The beach is still beautiful, and the waves are still high, but the house holds a secret that will never be washed away by the tide. It is the story of the lady who knew how she was going to die, and the little girl who had to watch it happen. There was one time when I was younger and I was putting on my pajamas for bed, a memory that has stayed tucked away in a dark corner of my mind for years. It was the kind of ordinary night that you never expect to turn into a life-changing mystery. The house was quiet, wrapped in that deep, heavy silence that only comes in the middle of the night when the rest of the world has gone to sleep. I was upstairs in my bedroom, a space that had always felt like my private sanctuary, a place where I was safe from whatever monsters my imagination might have conjured during the day. On this particular night, the only other person upstairs was my brother. I could hear the steady, muffled drone of the water running in the bathroom because he was taking a long shower. The sound of the pipes humming in the walls was a comforting, familiar noise. A reminder that I wasn't completely alone on the second floor. Everyone else was downstairs, far enough away that their voices were just a low, indistinguishable murmur, but close enough that I knew they were there if I needed them. I remember the exact feeling of the carpet under my feet and the slight chill in the air as I stood there in the center of my room. I was in the middle of getting dressed, pulled halfway into my pajamas when the atmosphere in the room seemed to shift. You know that feeling when you can tell someone is standing right outside your door, even if they don't make a sound. It's like the air pressure changes, or your skin just knows that a presence is close by. I paused for a second, my hands holding onto the fabric of my shirt, waiting for a knock or my brother's voice to tell me he was out of the shower. But there was no knock. Instead, the doorknob on my door suddenly and violently began to jiggle. It wasn't a gentle turn or a curious nudge. It was a frantic, desperate rattling, as if someone was grabbing the brass handle and trying their absolute hardest to force their way into the room. The sound was jarring in the silence. The metal handle clattered against the latch with a sharp, aggressive energy that sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through my system. I froze where I stood, my heart hammering so hard against my ribs that I thought it might actually burst through my chest. My eyes were locked on that doorknob, watching it shake back and forth under the strength of whatever was on the other side. My first thought was that it was my brother playing a prank, trying to scare me before he went to his own room. But the math didn't add up. I could still hear the water running in the shower, the steady splash against the tub continuing without a break, and most importantly, I heard absolutely no noise from the hallway. No footsteps approaching the door, no heavy breathing, and no rustle of clothing. There was only the violent mechanical sound of the knob being shaken by an invisible hand. In that house, silence was almost impossible to find. We lived in one of those older homes that acted like a giant wooden instrument, amplifying every sound made within its walls. I grew up with the knowledge that from my bedroom I could hear everything that went on downstairs. If my parents were in the living room watching television, I could hear the muffled dialogue of the show. If someone was in the kitchen opening a drawer or setting a glass on the counter, the sound would travel up through the floorboards as if they were standing right next to me. The hallway upstairs was the most vocal part of all. It was covered in old hardwood planks that groaned and creaked under the weight of even a small child. If someone was walking in the hallway, I would hear the distinct thud and the squeak of the wood. If someone ran down the stairs, it sounded like thunder rolling through the house. There was no way to move through that space without announcing your presence to every room. Because I knew the house so well, my instinct was to check and see who was there. I was convinced that if I moved fast enough, I would catch my brother or one of my parents in the act of playing a joke. I threw on the rest of my pajamas in a blur of motion, my hands shaking so much I could barely guide my arms through the sleeves. I took 2 steps toward the door and grabbed the handle, feeling the cold metal still vibrating slightly from the force of the jiggling. I pulled the door open, my eyes wide and ready for a confrontation. But when I looked out into the hallway, there was nobody there. The hall was empty, bathed in the soft, yellow light coming from the bathroom door, which was still shut tight. I stood there, staring into the empty space, my mind racing as I tried to find a logical explanation. The hallway was a straight shot from my door to the stairs in the bathroom. If a person had been standing at my door and then decided to run away, as soon as they heard me move, they would have had to cross several feet of creaky floorboards. I would have heard the thump of their feet, the rustle of their movements, and the sound of them retreating down the stairs or into another room. But there was nothing. The only sound was the constant rhythmic splashing of the water in the shower. I walked a few steps down the hall and knocked on the bathroom door, my voice trembling as I called out my brother's name. He answered immediately, his voice muffled by the steam and the water, asking me what I wanted. He was clearly still in the middle of his shower, and there was no way he could have gotten from my door back into that bathroom without making a sound or leaving the floor soaking wet. I started freaking out after I put everything together. The logic of the situation was falling apart, and the more I thought about it, the more horrific it became. If it wasn't my brother, and no one could have moved through the hallway without me hearing them, then what had been standing on the other side of that door? The jiggling had been so violent, so purposeful. It felt like something that was angry, something that was desperate to get into the room where I was most vulnerable. I stood in the middle of the hallway, feeling the cold air from the vents blowing against my skin, and I realized that I was looking at a space that should have held a person, but held only shadows. The house, which had always been so noisy and communicative, had suddenly gone deaf and dumb to the thing that had touched my door. I went back into my room and locked the door, but the sense of security was gone. I sat on my bed with all the lights on, staring at the doorknob and waiting for it to move again. I stayed awake for hours, listening to every sound the house made. I heard my brother finish his shower, heard the water stop, heard him walk down the hall to his own room. His footsteps were loud and clear, exactly as they always were. I heard my parents come upstairs later, the heavy creak of the stairs announcing their arrival long before they reached the top. Everything was normal. Everything was as it should be, except for those few seconds when the world had broken its own rules. The horror of it wasn't just the noise. It was the impossible silence that surrounded it. It happened a couple of more times over the following months, always under the same circumstances. I would be alone in my room, usually at night, and that doorknob would start to rattle. It was never a gentle attempt to see if the door was unlocked. It was always that same frantic, violent jiggling that made the whole door shake in its frame. Each time I would rush to the door and look out, hoping to catch a glimpse of a shadow or hear the tail end of a footstep, but the hallway was always empty and silent. It was as if a ghost were standing there, a presence that didn't have the weight to make the floorboards creak but had the strength to rattle a heavy brass handle. After a few months, the occurrences just stopped. The house went back to being just an old, noisy building, and the entity, whatever it was, seemed to move on or lose interest. But even though the jiggling stopped, the memory of it didn't. I spent the rest of my time in that house, living in a state of quiet paranoia. I never liked being upstairs alone, and I certainly never liked being half-dressed in my own room. I would find myself constantly checking the doorknob, making sure the lock was engaged, and listening to the sounds of the hallway with a level of intensity that wasn't healthy. I realized that the house I loved, the house where I could hear everything, was also a house that could hide a monster in plain sight. If something can move without making a sound on those creaky boards, then you are never truly alone, even when the silence tells you that you are. I often think about the nature of that visitor. In the world of horror, there are stories about entities that need an invitation to enter a room, and the jiggling door could have been its way of trying to get me to open it. If I had opened that door while the knob was still shaking, would I have seen something standing there? Or would I have just felt a cold rush of air as something invisible walked into my private space? The fact that I always waited until the noise stopped before looking out might have been the only thing that kept me safe. My instinct to check and see was a dangerous one, a curiosity that could have led me directly into the arms of something that didn't belong in our world. The acoustics of that house are what haunt me the most. I could hear my dad snoring downstairs. I could hear the cat jumping off the sofa in the living room, and I could hear the rain hitting the roof. I had a mental map of the house made entirely of sound. So when the sound of the doorknob happened in a vacuum of silence, it was like a tear in the fabric of my reality. It was a sensory contradiction that my brain couldn't reconcile. It proved that there was a gap in my super hearing, a blind spot where something could exist and act without being detected by the house's usual alarms. That is a specialized kind of horror, the realization that your primary sense of safety is flawed. Years later, I asked my brother if he ever experienced anything like that. He laughed and said no, but he did admit that he always hated the upstairs hallway at night. He said he always felt like he had to run from the bathroom to his room, as if something was reaching out from the darkness of the spare bedrooms to grab his ankles. He never saw anything and he never heard the door, but he felt the same heavy, predatory energy that I did. It made me realize that I wasn't just a paranoid kid with a big imagination. The house had a presence, a lingering shadow that focused its attention on me for those few months, testing the locks and waiting for a moment of weakness. The joyful villa, the kind baker, the handsome professor. All these stories you've shared involve people hiding their true nature behind a pleasant mask. My story is about a house hiding its nature behind a mask of noise. We think that if we can hear everything, we can stay safe. But the most terrifying things are the ones that don't make a sound. The violent jiggle of the knob was the only part of the entity that was allowed to cross over into my world, a physical manifestation of a desire to get in. It was a fucked up situation, as the saying goes, because there was no way to fight it and no way to understand it. I was just a kid in my pajamas, staring at a piece of hardware that was being manipulated by a ghost. I still live in a house with old wooden floors, and sometimes, late at night, I'll hear a creak that I can't explain. My heart will skip a beat, and I'll look toward the door, half expecting to see that handle start to move. The trauma of that night hasn't left me. It's just become a part of how I navigate the world. I am much more aware of the silences in a room than I am of the noises. I listen for the things that aren't there, for the footsteps that should be happening but aren't. It's a strange way to live, but it's the only way I know how after what happened in that upstairs hallway. The fact that it happened a few more times before stopping is what bothers me. It suggests that the entity was persistent, that it was trying to find a pattern or a time when I would be more likely to open the door. It was learning my routine, watching me through the wood of the door and waiting. Why did it stop? Did it find someone else to bother? Or did it realize that I was never going to give it the invitation it needed? I like to think that my stubborn refusal to engage with it while it was shaking the knob was what eventually drove it away. I was a paranoid kid, but that paranoia was my greatest defense. The world is full of these small, impossible moments that we usually try to forget. We tell ourselves it was the wind, or a dream, or a trick of the light. But when you're standing there and you see the brass turning with your own eyes, you can't lie to yourself anymore. You know that you've touched the unknown, and the unknown has touched you back. The jiggling doorknob is my personal ghost, a memory that reminds me that the boundaries of our world are much thinner than they seem. The house is still standing, I imagine, and someone else is probably sleeping in that room now, perhaps wondering why the hallway feels so cold at night. I hope that by sharing this, it makes you feel a little less alone in your own scary memories. We all have that one event that we can't explain, that one moment where the rules of reality were suspended. It's part of the human experience to encounter the darkness and come out the other side with a story to tell. My story is a simple one, a door, a knob, and a silence that shouldn't have been there. But it's a story that taught me more about the world than any book ever could. It taught me to listen to the silence, to lock the doors, and to never, ever underestimate the things that move in the middle of the night. The house might be gone or renovated now, and the super hearing I had as a kid might have faded with age. But the feeling of that night is still fresh. I can still see the yellow light under the bathroom door and the empty, creaky hallway. I can still hear the water splashing in the tub and the sharp, rhythmic clatter of the brass handle. It is a horror that doesn't need a climax or a resolution. It just needs to exist, a permanent question mark in the history of my life. And as long as I remember it, that entity is still there, standing on the other side of a door I never opened. I was about 8 or 9 when I was at my grandparents' in their old house, and that visit is something that still plays in the back of my mind like a movie I can't turn off. We were visiting from Carlow, which was about 70 kilometers away from where they lived in the deep, quiet countryside of Ireland. At that age, a journey like that felt like traveling to another world. The roads were narrower, the trees seemed taller and darker, and the air had a heavy, damp quality that felt like it was holding on to secrets from 100 years ago. My grandparents' house was a sprawling, ancient place, with thick stone walls and floors that groaned whenever you took a step. It was the kind of home where the shadows didn't just stay in the corners, they seemed to stretch out toward you as soon as the sun went down. Because I was still young and the house felt so intimidating, I slept in the spare room with my mom. I remember the smell of that room, old lavender, dust, and the faint, cold scent of stone. It was supposed to be a place of rest, but for me, it was the beginning of a nightmare that has never truly ended. The center of the house, and the center of my fear, was the sitting room. It was a formal space, filled with heavy curtains and antique furniture that nobody was ever allowed to sit on. But there was one piece of furniture that stood out from the rest, an old wooden rocking chair. It sat in the corner facing the fireplace, looking perfectly innocent during the day. It was made of dark, polished oak with high back slats and curved runners that were worn smooth from years of use. But as soon as night fell and the house went silent, the chair would start to move. Every single night, without fail, the rhythmic sound of wood on wood would echo through the hallway. Creak, thump, creak, thump, creak, thump. It wasn't a fast movement, it was slow and steady, as if someone were sitting there deep in thought, staring into the cold, empty hearth. My mother and grandparents always had a logical explanation for it. They would tell me it was just the wind or the old house settling into the ground. They said the draft from the fireplace was catching the back of the chair and making it sway. But I knew better. The windows in that sitting room were always tightly shut and locked, and the curtains didn't even flutter. The air in that room felt dead and heavy, like it was being held in a vacuum. There was no wind that could have moved a chair made of solid oak. Whenever I had to pass by the sitting room at night to go to the bathroom, I would catch a glimpse of it in the moonlight. The chair would be rocking back and forth, and for a split second, I would see a shape, a faint, translucent outline of a person whose weight seemed to be making the floorboards beneath the runners moan in protest. I was absolutely terrified. I would run back to the spare room and dive under the covers, my heart hammering against my ribs, convinced that whatever was in that chair was watching me. Eventually, my terror became too much for the family to ignore. I would cry and refuse to go near the sitting room, and my mother finally convinced my grandfather that the chair had to go. They didn't want to throw it away because it was a family heirloom, so they decided to put it in the shed at the back of the garden. I remember watching my grandfather and my uncle carry it out. They looked like they were struggling, even though it was just a chair. They hauled it across the grass and shoved it into the dark, cluttered shed, closing the heavy wooden door and latching it shut. That evening, for the first time in years, the sitting room was silent. There was no creaking, no thumping, and the air felt a little bit lighter. I went to bed that night feeling a massive sense of relief, thinking that the nightmare was finally over. But the relief didn't last long. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a strange, flickering light dancing on the walls of the spare room. It wasn't the soft, white light of the moon. It was a bright, angry orange. I sat up and looked out the window, and my breath caught in my throat. The shed at the back of the garden was completely engulfed in flames. The fire was roaring, sending showers of sparks into the black sky, and the heat was so intense I could feel it through the glass of the window. The most terrifying part wasn't the fire itself, but the way it was moving. It didn't look like a normal house fire. The flames seemed to be swirling around the shed, concentrated directly on the spot where the rocking chair had been placed. I watched in a trance-like state as the wooden structure crumbled and collapsed into a pile of glowing ash. The house, luckily, was unscathed. The shed was about 10 meters away from the main building, and there was no wind that night to carry the fire toward the stone walls. My grandfather and the neighbors eventually put the fire out, but there was nothing left to save. Everything inside the shed was destroyed. The old tools, the lawnmower, the stacks of firewood, and of course, the rocking chair. When the sun came up the next morning, I walked out to the blackened patch of earth where the shed had stood. Among the twisted metal and charred remains of the equipment, I saw the skeleton of the rocking chair. The wood was mostly gone, but the heavy oak runners were still there, half buried in the ash. They weren't just burnt, they were melted into strange, distorted shapes that looked like hands reaching out from the ground. To this day, I don't know the truth of what started that fire. My mother and grandmother wondered if some local kids had snuck into the garden and set it on fire as a prank, or if some oily rags had spontaneously combusted in the summer heat. There was even a part of me that wondered if my grandfather had decided to play a dark, twisted joke on me, thinking that burning the haunted chair would finally prove to me that it was gone. But when I saw his face that morning, he didn't look like a man who had played a joke. He looked pale, his eyes darting toward the empty corner of the sitting room with a look of genuine confusion and fear. He never spoke about the fire, and he never bought another rocking chair. The horror of that night didn't end with the fire. It lived in the silence of the house afterward. Even with the chair gone, the sitting room never felt right. You would walk in there and feel a sudden drop in temperature, or you would hear a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the floorboards in the corner. It was as if the fire hadn't destroyed the entity attached to the chair. It had only freed it from its wooden cage. I spent the next few years of my childhood being afraid of the dark, always looking at the corners of rooms and waiting for something to start rocking. The idea that a piece of furniture could have so much energy attached to it, enough to seemingly cause its own destruction when moved, is something that still gives me goosebumps. I think about the history of that chair and the people who might have sat in it over the decades. My grandmother told me once that it had belonged to her great-aunt, a woman who had lost her mind after her husband died at sea. She would spend all day and all night in that chair, rocking and staring out at the horizon, waiting for a ship that never came. When she died, they found her still sitting in it, her cold hands gripping the armrests so tightly they had to pry them off. Maybe she never stopped waiting. Maybe she didn't want to be moved to a shed, away from the warmth of the house and the view of the hearth. Maybe the fire was her final angry protest against being discarded. Growing up in Ireland, you hear a lot of stories about the supernatural, about things that are tied to the land and the old homes. People usually laugh them off as folklore, but when you've seen a heavy chair move on its own and then watched it burn in a fire that seemed to come from nowhere, you stop laughing. It changed the way I look at old things. Now when I go into an antique shop or an old house, I'm careful not to touch the furniture too much. I don't want to wake up whatever might be sleeping in the grain of the wood. I realize that some objects aren't just things. They are vessels for the people who loved them or hated them or couldn't leave them behind. The distance from Carlo to my grandparents' house felt like 1,000 miles after that night. I didn't want to go back there for a long time. Even when we did visit, I would stay as far away from the sitting room as possible. I would watch my mother and my grandparents go about their lives as if everything were normal, but I could see the way they avoided looking at the empty corner. We all lived with the secret knowledge that something had happened that defied logic. The fire had taken the shed, but it had left the mystery behind, a dark stain on the memory of my childhood. The horror of the story is the realization that we are never truly in control of our surroundings. We like to think that we are safe in our homes, protected by stone walls and locked windows, but there are forces that don't care about locks or walls. The rocking chair was a physical manifestation of a presence that was far older and more powerful than any of us. It was a witness to the passing of time, a silent observer of a family's history, and it chose to end its existence in a blaze of glory rather than be forgotten in a dark shed. It's a specialized kind of dread to know that the objects in your life might have their own intentions. I often wonder what would have happened if they hadn't moved the chair. Would it have stayed in the corner forever, creaking through the nights while the family grew old? Or would the fire have started inside the house instead? Maybe by moving it to the shed, my grandfather inadvertently saved all of our lives. Maybe the entity was planning to burn the house down with us in it, and moving it 10 meters away was the only thing that kept us from being part of that pile of ash. The what-ifs are what keep me awake at night, even now that I'm an adult living far away from that old Irish house. The shed was never rebuilt. For the rest of my grandparents' lives, that patch of ground stayed black and empty, a scar on the garden that refused to grow over. It served as a permanent reminder of the night the chair died. My grandfather eventually passed away, and then my grandmother, and the house was sold to a new family who had no idea what had happened in the sitting room. I sometimes think about them sitting in that room on a quiet night, and I wonder if they ever hear a faint, rhythmic sound coming from the corner. I wonder if they feel the sudden chill or see the curtains flutter when there is no wind. I hope for their sake that the fire was enough to send the spirit on its way, but I have my doubts. The Irish countryside is full of places like that, old homes that carry the weight of the generations that lived and died within them. We are just temporary tenants in these spaces, sharing them with the ghosts of the past. The story of the rocking chair is my own personal ghost story, a piece of my history that reminds me to be humble in the face of the unknown. It proves that the world is a much stranger place than we can see with our eyes, and that sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones that look the most ordinary. A chair, a shed, a fire, it sounds so simple, but the reality was a horrific encounter with something that didn't belong to our world. As I look back on that 8 or 9-year-old kid in Carlo, I wish I could tell him that he was right to be afraid. I wish I could tell him that his instincts were sharper than the logic of the adults around him. But mostly, I'm glad he ran. I'm glad we all got out of that house unscathed, even if the memory of the fire still burns in the back of my mind. The old house is still there, I imagine, standing in the mist of the Irish night, holding onto its secrets and its shadows. And somewhere in the ruins of a shed that no longer exists, the spirit of a rocking chair still lingers, a silent warning to anyone who thinks they can outrun the past. The mystery of whether it was arson, a prank, or the supernatural is something that will never be solved. And that is perhaps the most frightening part of all. Without a clear answer, the mind is free to imagine the worst. I choose to believe that the chair had a soul, or at least a fragment of one, and that it chose its own ending. It's a story of a lucky escape, but it's also a story of a loss of innocence, and a loss of a family heirloom that carried more than just wood and velvet. It carried a presence that was too big for a sitting room and too angry for a shed. The world is a place of light and shadow, and that night in Ireland, the shadows won. They took the shed and the chair, leaving only the fear behind. I carry that fear with me, a quiet companion that reminds me to stay vigilant and to always trust the cold prickle on the back of my neck. The rocking chair might be gone, but the sound of it moving is something I will never forget. Creak, thump, creak, thump, creak, thump. It is the heartbeat of a house that was haunted by its own history, and it is a sound that will follow me forever. I was working at the park back then, young and still in school, and that night I was assigned near America Sings. It was the summer of 1974, a time when the world seemed a bit brighter and the magic of the park felt indestructible. At that age, having a job at the greatest theme park on earth felt like a dream. The air was always thick with the scent of popcorn, sugary churros, and the mechanical smell of ozone and grease that wafted from the massive attractions. But the park at night is a different kind of animal. Once the sun dips below the horizon and the colorful neon lights flicker to life, the shadows in the corners of the buildings seem to stretch and deepen. The laughter of the crowd starts to sound a bit more hollow, and the mechanical hum of the rides begins to feel like a low, rhythmic breathing. One of the attendants on the ride was a girl named Debbie. She was quiet, polite, and just doing her job like the rest of us. She had this gentle energy about her, always moving through her tasks with a calm efficiency that made her stand out among the rest of the frantic summer staff. Late that night, as the park began to wind down and the final crowds were making their way through Tomorrowland, her theater section emptied out. The attraction was a massive revolving theater called America Sings, which had only been open for a few days. It was a marvel of engineering, a circular building where the audience sat in a ring of seats that rotated around a fixed central stage. As the show progressed, the entire seating area would shift, moving the guests from one musical act to the next. Between these acts, massive walls would open and close with a heavy mechanical finality. Debbie stayed behind in one of these empty sections, waiting for the next group of guests so she could load them in. That part of the job was routine. There was nothing unusual about it at all. It was the kind of repetitive task that lets your mind wander, a moment of quiet in the middle of a loud, busy shift. But what most people didn't realize back then was that the building was a giant, unfeeling machine. It was a labyrinth of moving parts, heavy steel, and massive motors that didn't have the capacity to recognize a human being in the wrong place. The tolerances between the rotating seating area and the stationary walls were incredibly tight. Just a few inches of space separated a safe seat from a lethal pinch point. Then suddenly, people nearby heard a scream. It was loud and terrifying, but short. It was the kind of sound that pierces through the ambient noise of a crowd like a jagged blade. But in a place where people are constantly yelling with excitement or surprise, a single scream often gets lost in the shuffle. Some guests in the adjacent theater sections thought it was part of the show, perhaps a sound effect added to give the musical numbers a bit more character. Because the park was built on the idea of manufactured thrills, nobody reacted right away. The music kept playing, the animatronic birds kept singing their cheerful tunes, and the giant gears continued to grind. America Sings worked differently than most rides. The stage in the middle never moved. Instead, the audience seats rotated around it, and the walls opened and closed as the theater turned. Because her section had just emptied, no one knows exactly where Debbie was standing in those final moments. Maybe she slipped on the polished floor. Maybe she reached for something that had fallen between the seats. Or maybe she tried to move between sections while the theater was in motion, thinking she had enough time to clear the gap. No one ever found out the truth of her final movements. The only thing that is certain is that she found herself in the dead zone, the narrow space where the rotating outer ring met the stationary concrete wall of the building. When the theater rotated again, she was caught between a moving section and a part that didn't move at all. There was nowhere for her to go. The machinery didn't slow down, and it didn't stop. It just kept moving with the weight of 1,000 tons. She was crushed instantly. The horror of that moment is matched only by the psychological nightmare that followed. The show was programmed to continue regardless of what was happening in the wings. As the theater moved into the next act, the upbeat, happy music of the attraction continued to blare through the speakers. The animatronic characters, with their glass eyes and jerky movements, continued to perform for the guests in the other sections. The worst part came later. Other attendants rotated into the final scene of the show and saw her body. Until that moment, they honestly believed the screaming was part of the attraction. They had been standing just feet away, separated by a thin wall, listening to a co-worker's life being snuffed out while they checked seatbelts and smiled at tourists. When the lights finally came up and the emergency stop was pulled, the silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream. It was the silence of a machine that had finished its meal. The news of the accident sent shockwaves through the park. For those of us working that night, the magic was gone. We looked at the colorful buildings and the smiling characters and saw them for what they really were. A facade covering up massive, dangerous industrial equipment. The ride eventually closed for a thorough investigation and several safety modifications, but the atmosphere around that building was permanently tainted. It felt cold even in the middle of a heat wave. When new attractions were eventually built in that same building, like Innoventions or the various exhibits that followed, the rotating system was completely removed. The engineers decided that the risks were too high and the design was fundamentally flawed. Nothing else ever used it again. The building was gutted, the gears were stripped away, and the floor was bolted down. But for those of us who remember, the memory of those rotating walls remains. Even now, decades later, the shadow of that night lingers in other parts of the park. When the carousel of progress breaks down and the lights come on, cast members shout at guests to stay seated. Their voices often carry a sharp, urgent edge that seems out of place for a minor technical glitch. Some people get annoyed, thinking the staff is being power-trippy or overly dramatic. Some ignore them entirely, standing up to stretch their legs or get a better look at the animatronics. They don't know the reason behind that fear. They don't understand that the rules they think are just suggestions are actually written in blood. They don't know that the people working those rides are trained to see the machinery as a predator that is always waiting for a moment of human error. But I do. I remember the look on the faces of the crew that night. I remember the way the music sounded when it was finally turned off, leaving only the sound of the wind and the distant hum of the park. Every time I see someone try to stand up before the doors open, it makes my stomach turn. I feel a cold prickle of goosebumps on my arms because I can still hear that short, sharp scream in the back of my mind. Because if that ride ever started moving again, even for a moment, it would only take seconds for another tragedy to happen. The park likes to tell us that it's a place where dreams come true, but it's also a place where reality can be incredibly cruel. The machines don't care about your vacation, and they don't care about your life. They only care about the gears and the timers and the relentless forward motion of the show. The story of Debbie has become something of an urban legend over the years, a ghost story told by new cast members during late-night shifts. Some say you can still hear a faint scratching sound against the walls of that building when the park is empty. Others claim to have seen a girl in a 1970s-style uniform standing in the corners of the theater, watching the guests with a sad, distant expression. But to me, she isn't a ghost. She was a real person, a girl who went to work one summer night and never came home. The true horror isn't in the supernatural, it's in the mechanical. It's the thought of being trapped in a space that is shrinking, knowing that no matter how hard you push, the metal isn't going to give way. It's the sound of the music playing while your world is ending. I often think about the guests who were in the theater that night. I wonder if they ever think back on that sound effect they heard. I wonder if they realized later that they were the last people to hear a human voice that was being silenced forever. The park is a master of illusion, and that night the illusion was so perfect that it masked a murder by machinery. It makes you wonder what else is happening just behind the walls of the other rides. When you're sitting in the dark of a haunted mansion or flying through the stars on a roller coaster. You're trusting your life to a computer and a series of sensors. You're trusting that the dead zones have all been accounted for and that the pinch points have been guarded. Debbie's death led to massive changes in how theme parks handle safety. It brought in new regulations, better training, and a much more cautious approach to moving platforms. But those changes came at a terrible price. Every safety sensor and every warning sign in the park today is there because someone somewhere had a lucky escape or a tragic end. The Magic Kingdom is built on a foundation of lessons learned the hard way. When I walk through Tomorrowland now, I don't see the futuristic city of the future. I see the shadows of the past. I see a quiet, polite girl who was just doing her job, and I see the giant building that took her away from us. The Carousel of Progress is one of the few remaining attractions that still uses a version of that rotating theater design, though it is much more heavily guarded and monitored now. But the fear remains. It's a specialized kind of anxiety that you only understand if you've seen what happens when the system fails. We shout at the guests to stay seated because we know that the machinery doesn't have a soul. It doesn't have a stop button that triggers automatically when it feels something in the gap. It only knows how to follow its programming, and that programming doesn't include the value of a human life. I eventually left the park and moved on to other things, but that summer in school stayed with me. It taught me that the world is a much more fragile place than we like to admit. It taught me that even in the middle of a celebration, darkness is never far away. The image of the empty theater section and the waiting girl is a permanent part of my memory. It's a story that I don't tell often because people don't want to hear about the blood behind the magic. They want to believe in the illusion. They want to believe that they are perfectly safe. But I know the truth. I know that the "Pop Goes the Weasel" song that used to play in America Sings had a much more literal and horrific meaning that night. The park continues to grow and change. New lands are built, old rides are torn down, and the technology becomes more and more advanced. But the laws of physics and the danger of heavy machinery remain constant. As long as there are moving parts and human beings, there will be the potential for tragedy. The best we can do is to listen to the warnings, stay in our seats, and never forget the people who weren't so lucky. Debbie's story is a reminder that we are all just guests in a world of gears and steel, and we should never get too comfortable in the dark. I hope she found peace, and I hope that her family found some kind of closure in the years that followed. But for those of us who were there, the closure never really comes. Every time I hear a mechanical hum or the sound of a heavy door closing, I'm back in Tomorrowland in 1974. I'm back in the humid night air, listening for a scream that I hope I never hear again. The rotating theaters are gone, but the fear is still there, tucked away in the shadows of the buildings and the hearts of the old-timers who remember the truth. The magic is still there too, I suppose, but it's a magic that is tinged with a deep, lingering sadness. If you ever find yourself at the park and you're sitting in a theater that starts to move, think of her. Think of the quiet girl who was just doing her job. And please, for the sake of everyone who works there and for your own sake, stay in your seat. Don't try to see what's behind the wall. Don't try to beat the timer, because the machines are always moving and they don't know how to stop for you. The joyful villa, the kind baker, the handsome professor, they are all masks, and the park is the biggest mask of all. Beneath it is the steel, the grease, and the memory of a girl named Debbie. The park at night is still a beautiful place, but I can't look at it the same way. I see the safety sensors and the emergency exits, and I think about why they are there. I think about the cost of our entertainment. We pay for the thrills, but sometimes the price is much higher than a ticket. It's a lesson that I learned young, and it's a lesson that I will carry with me forever. Stay seated. Keep your hands and feet inside the vehicle. And never, ever forget that the show must go on, even when the world is falling apart. If you're still here, it means these stories didn't just pass through you, they stayed. Every story you heard tonight was real. Real people, real moments. And in every one of them, something went wrong, or almost did. If you want to keep exploring the stories that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Shadow Archives.